Okay.
The acoustics here are really bad. It was a bit like it's cold, it's a church, and the acoustics were really awful.
There are microphones.
There's microphones, and there's sort of 6 really well.
So these two fixed microphones should pick you up relatively well.
Okay.
But you will need to speak up a little bit, I'm afraid. So.
I've got quite a loud voice.
Good.
Everyone tells me I'm very loud, so
Keep doing it.
it's fine.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah. I hope you're all right doing the kind of apocalyptic intro.
Well, I'll tone it down.
Yeah.
Now, it would be short and crisp, but then I'll sort of finish off a bit with some red meat to get one bit.
Okay. Brilliant. That's a great intro for the to say what they're doing. How that works, and hopefully we'll have some good questions. And you can, I hope, bring. Sometimes we might need a broader perspective, or a perspective, or policy history, things that you're put at your fingertips that maybe it's more to understand.
Don't do that one.
Yeah, just speaking to William actually, he said sends his regards.
Oh, right. Well, that's strange because William was just on. William times it so badly.
Oh, he does with me as well.
You're just out the door. And you know when he says.
So comfortable to be honest.
I was a bit like,
You know when he says William here. You've got to do a watch adjustment.
So he always does it. So I just got home to get my bottle of beans to come here, and the phone rings. It's brilliant. I'm late.
Yeah, I think you just have to be a bit brutal. At least that's it, right? Where possible.
we do,
I
it's
think
quite
he's having trouble at risk
very
because
cold.
I've abandoned ship.
So how do you want to introduce it?
Well, the university. I thought I was heading out the back door, really nice and quiet, and the university has went. Professor Emeritus, how about that? Do you like the sound of that? So I said, well, so long as I'm dictating what I can do,
Yeah.
when this so
Yes.
so I'm still required to keep my emeritus professor.
You should be.
Do you want to bet that it's
Got a little thing. Yeah.
I'll tell you when it's
I'll have set a timer on the phone. But if you think that things are getting out of hand, just tell us.
This is quite possible.
I like that. Getting out of hand. Getting a bit riotous.
so 4 minutes.
Oh, good. No, everybody's sitting down. Good.
Everybody's gone quiet. They clearly think something's going to happen.
Yeah,
don't they?
yeah. Well, I was going to say a bit like a church. Sounds a bit nutty when you say that. hard.
Thank you, Katherine. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to juggle a piece of paper and a phone and 2 microphones, but we'll see how we get on. Thank you. Hello, I'm Dominic, your team rector and rural dean, and welcome to the 2024 Climate Conference on the hot topic of environment, food and farming. Should we have a round of applause again? So on behalf of Halesworth Action for Sustainability Hub, which is a collaboration of the Blyth Valley Churches and Halesworth Town Council, welcome to this evening. Just before I get on to just a few opening comments of my own, I'll do my air hostess bit. Health and safety, fire exits, doors at the back. If you make your way to the back, the doors will open as the first person gets them, opens them and makes their way out. There'll be people there also to help you if you find yourself taken over ill or uncomfortable. The toilets over the market square, and in the church hall through that door, and there's an accessible portaloo or similar trade mark outside the back door on that side. And then there are some events taking place as this event continues, the conference continues over the next day or two. I've been invited to remind you that tomorrow the talks and workshops begin at 9:30 here with refreshments and a soup lunch. There's a bring and share lunch after an 11 o'clock service here on Sunday with some What Next sessions, and a quiet time for reflection and stillness at St Mary's Cheddiston from 3 o'clock with a 6 o'clock candlelit Taizé service full of chanting and candles and icons, if not incense, out there to round off proceedings on Sunday evening. All are welcome. So some readings from the Hebrew scripture, which, as you know, Christians tend to call somewhat dismissively the Old Testament. You may plant seed in your field for 6 years, and you may trim your vineyards for 6 years and bring in their fruits. But during the 7th year, you must let the land rest. This will be a special time to honour the Lord. You must not plant seed in your field or trim your vineyards. You must not cut the crops that grow by themselves after harvest, or gather the grapes from your vines that are not trimmed. The land will have a year of rest. You may eat whatever the land produces during that year of rest. It will be food for your men and women and servants, for your hired workers and for the foreigners living in your country. It will also be food for your cattle and the wild animals of your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten. When you harvest your crops on your land, do not harvest all the way to the corners of your field. If grain falls on the ground, don't gather it up. Leave it for poor people and foreigners in your country. I am the Lord your God. If you remember my laws and commands and obey them, I will give you rains at the right season. The land will produce crops, and the trees of the field will produce their fruit. And in the prayer that I found earlier today from the Diocese of York. We pray for our farming community, for all who, as stewards of your creation, work so hard to produce our food and care for our precious environment. God, at this time of turbulence and change, and with the long-term impact of severe weather, there are some who are bewildered as they fear for their future. Guide all who farm to cherish your creation in their endeavour to produce healthy food. We pray for every farming family as they consider the options available. May each business discern the way forward to a viable and fulfilling future. We pray for policymakers that they may bring clarity of policy and direction, enabling food security and ecological balance. We give thanks for all involved in the safe production and passage of food, and pray that all, including farmers and growers, receive a fair reward for their labour. We pray that all who consume their produce, including ourselves, may value and appreciate the sacredness of food and the graft and commitment involved in bringing it to our table. And so it's a great pleasure to hand it over to Adrian, Ramsay MP, to open our conference.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and thank you to Rachel and to all of the organisers of this weekend's event. How fantastic it is to have our second climate conference here in Halesworth, and it's an honour for me to be introducing it as the local MP for the new Ravenous. See lots of faces in the audience of people I spoke to during the campaign, people who I know actively helped in my campaign. I think there were hundreds and hundreds, and I'm so indebted to you for all of your support. Whether you voted for me or not, whether you live in the Waveney Valley constituency or not, I want to be able to be a voice for change, a voice for sustainability in East Anglia and in the UK, and certainly determined to be a strong local constituency MP as well as pressing for the changes that we need to see nationally. So delighted to be able to speak tonight. And as I was thinking about these opening words, I was looking back at these wonderful drawings, the visual minutes that we had from last year's conference. I spent lots of you were at the conference last year. I had the opportunity to be part of the panel. We're about to have this year's panel. We had a really good discussion on a wide range of different issues to do with sustainability. And just thinking about those discussions and where we're at a year on, of course, the challenges that we face environmentally have only got bigger. But a lot has changed politically. We have a new government. We have 4 Green MPs to hold that government to account and push the government to be bolder. And we'll do that in a constructive way, whether it's on the environment or whether it's on the other big issues that are affecting my constituency. So was that not on until just now? I would be projecting more if I knew I needed to. Hopefully you were still hearing me with that. Good, I would have projected if I knew I needed to. So, yeah, things have moved on a long way in the last year, but there's so much that we need to do to rise to the environmental challenges that we face. And I'd like to talk about the climate emergency and the nature emergency alongside each other, because they're both huge challenges, both related challenges, and often the nature side of that discussion, even though we are one of the most nature-depleted countries on earth, even though we depend on nature for our well-being, for the food we eat, for the water we drink, for the air we breathe, often the nature side of that debate doesn't get the same attention. And so I'm really pleased that we've got a real focus on land and food and sustainability in farming tonight. And having been with the panel over dinner just now, I think we're in for a lively discussion on the panel shortly, which I look forward to hearing. But in thinking about these issues and talking about where we're at with sustainability, I want to just share with you a few thoughts on the direction our government's taking and the ways in which myself and other Green MPs will be putting pressure on them to be bold in the action that's needed to be taken and to do so in a way that works for communities and for sustainability in the broader sense. And so in thinking about what do we need for a sustainable future, I think back to a report that was produced by an organisation I used to lead, the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales. They produced a report called Zero Carbon Britain that looked at the different ways in which we need to change our economy, our society to be able to rise to the climate challenge and have a zero carbon future. And there were always 3 elements of that report in the different iterations that we did. One was around what we call powering down, which is how we can reduce the energy that we're using. One was around powering up, which is around the transition to renewable energy, clean renewable energy from a wide variety of sources. And the other was around land use and farming and how we need to look at land and agriculture as a central issue to sustainability, which of course we'll hear about tonight. And in thinking about how the government's doing on those 3 issues, I think that the government has looked at sustainability and focused in very strongly on one of those 3 topics, on powering up renewable energy. Now, I've got a background in renewable energy. I've led charities focused on skills and rollout of renewable energy over the last 10 years. So I'm very passionate about us all having access to more cheap, clean, renewable energy. There's far more we can do to benefit from all sorts of renewables, whether it's wind, whether it's hydropower, wave power, or solar of different sorts. But the government's taking quite a simplistic approach to this, almost giving the impression that any application that's put forward will just be waved through. I want to see far more renewables of all sorts used, but I think the government can maybe be a bit more sophisticated in saying that if you're going to put forward a solar farm application, we want to see it put forward in a way that can be combined with agriculture. We want to see how it's going to be sensitive to the local community and sensitive to restoring nature. Whereas the government is sort of giving the impression with solar as it is with house building that it's a bit of a green light for any sort of development. So I think we can have a bit more of a sophisticated debate about how we do renewables in ways that are in keeping with the local community and in keeping with nature, but very much on the basis that we've got to scale up all sorts of renewables quickly. Then secondly, on the powering down, on energy efficiency, I think this is left out of the debate. It doesn't get anywhere near enough attention. How we reduce the amount of energy that we use. And it's often said, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's absolutely true, that the cheapest bill is the bill that you have to pay because you've reduced your energy bills right down. And that's why the Green Party has argued strongly that we need to have a nationwide programme, concerted area-by-area programme to insulate people's homes in a way that can bring bills down, keep homes warm, create jobs. And we haven't seen very much at all from the government on energy efficiency measures, whether that's around localising the economy, whether that's around ensuring that homes that are built, whether they be big housing developments or small sustainability initiatives, are really high quality in terms of sustainability. So we need far more focus on powering down as well. And then thirdly, on nature and land use. This is an area where I think the government's attitude as a whole are just not focused on this topic. Even though we're one of the most nature-depleted countries on earth, even though we could be doing far more to support all the many farmers in Suffolk and Norfolk who I speak to who want to do more to grow food in a sustainable way, actually the government has reduced or threatened to reduce the nature-friendly farming budget just when national charities like the RSPB and the National Trust have said we need to double the size of the nature-friendly farming budget and make it easier to access if we're really going to power ahead with nature-friendly farming. And there's all sorts of other elements of that debate which you'll hear about more tonight in terms of localising the economy, in terms of the types of food we eat and how we can move to a more sustainable future. But I've been particularly pressing the nature-friendly farming grants in the debates in Parliament. So I look forward to the discussion tonight, and I hope the conference over this weekend goes on to be a great success, because every time I'm here in Halesworth and indeed in the other market towns in my constituency, I sense a real passion that people want a drive for a sustainable future. I sense that at the election where people voted very positively for a change and to send a clear message that we want to have green representatives at all levels of government to push the new government to be bolder. That's my job nationally, to press for the policy changes that we need, as well as representing people's concerns here in Waverley Valley. And it's really my pleasure, my honour to be able to represent you and represent these crucial causes of our time in Parliament. So thank you for the dynamism that all of you in Halesworth and beyond bring to this debate. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you through these conferences and other events as we push for making the most of more sustainability initiatives locally and nationally. And I look forward to hearing this discussion tonight. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Is it coming out of the... So last year, very different times, weren't they? I sat on this panel and we did have some trouble with the microphone, so I just want to make sure that these two are working as well. Yeah, oh, that sounds good. Oh, we're all here. Brilliant. What a fantastic evening. And a little bit before we were all eating together, and I asked Rachel and Judith, thank you so much for organising this again, by the way. What an incredible effort and what an amazing weekend. What it was that they were hoping would emerge from tonight and from this weekend, and Rachel gave a very long explanation that began in the 1970s, and took in Greenpeace India, campaigns for plastic, but ultimately ex-boyfriends. But ultimately, what Rachel and Judith are hoping will happen this evening is that this will spark conversations, that this will begin an investigation amongst all of us together into how we can change things locally, what questions we need to be asking nationally, and what things we need to be pushing for globally. And I hope that we're going to have a really interesting conversation about that tonight. The other thing that emerged, which Adrian has hinted at in the conversation as we ate, is that I thought we were all going to basically agree on the panel, but I don't think we will. And I think we're all on the same page, but I think there are details on which we probably disagree, and I think that's going to spark some interesting conversations. So we've got a brilliant panel. We've got broadly 4 farmers, 1 bean trader and an emeritus professor. So it's quite a heady mix. But under those headlines, there are all sorts of details which we're going to explore at the moment. What I wanted to do is read a quote which Rachel had asked us to use as a provocation before we were beginning our conversations. And the quote is from Henry Dimbleby's book, Ravenous, which I recommend. It's got good bits, it's got bad bits, like any book about complicated things like food systems, but it is very provocative and it does offer all sorts of interesting insights. And Henry Dimbleby asks in that book, how can we feed ourselves affordably without destroying both our own health and the health of the planet. And I think that's a really interesting starting point. I think we could unpack that in lots of really interesting ways. For me, affordably hints at cheaply, and I think that's problematic. I think what Henry's really driving at is how do we feed ourselves equitably? How do we ensure that everyone has the food that they need? So I don't want to be distracted by the cost of food. I'd like to think more about how we distribute food and how we make sure everyone has enough to eat. And I also want tonight to be quite interactive. And Dominic's beautiful introduction and that reminder that the Old Testament was basically grounded in organic farming. I did feel slightly awkwardly that as I looked at his back that we were actually sitting behind the altar. And I always feel in these sorts of situations that it's problematic that you've got a row up the front. We were more balanced, but we have ended up being mostly men. We are aware of that. But I don't want you to feel that we're the experts sitting at the front. We're the people that happen to be beginning the conversation, but I'm hoping that you're going to provoke us to talk amongst ourselves and that some of the things that we say you'll be able to feed back on. And to try and inspire some of that interaction, I've asked all the panellists to bring a prop with them. And in a minute I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask that the props be circulated through the audience for you all to look at and think about and maybe wonder why they've been brought in, and that will be revealed towards the end. Adrian, as our elected representative and public servant, I'm going to ask you to take the props out into the audience if that's all right. And so as the panel are ready for that to happen, I'll ask you to come and just put them somewhere in the audience. I think that will be great. I'm not going to introduce you. I'm going to allow you to introduce yourselves. I think that's the best thing to do, and we'll start right at this end with Glenn.
Okay, good evening. Can everyone hear me? No. Okay, so can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yes. Well, let's essentially be
Shut
different.
the lot, silent.
So, do we need some of the roving mics?
Well, anyway, I'll stand up, might help. So, I'm Glenn Buckingham. I'm County Chairman for the National Farmers Union. I'm Farm Manager at Helmingham Estate Farms for the home farm of the Tollemash family. And I also have a small enterprise with my wife and a local community. We are at Helmingham. We've been in stewardship schemes and no-till type farming for the last 25 years. We value the assets of our soil, the hedgerows. We have some 80 kilometres of hedgerows. We have 52 ponds, of which 40 I've cleaned out in the last 30 years. And we look after some 50 meadows, which are average just 5 acres each, alongside the deer park of 135 hectares. And we have approximately 70 hectares of woodland, and we have planted trees, and we've just started on our journey on agroforestry the last 3 years. And we utilise things like the wild bird seed mixes and things in strips across the fields, and in the fields we integrate them now more so in the fields, not in little patches in the corners and things like that. And we've studied the whole farm for organic matter. Some 2016 we tested every hectares. We know our organic matter and therefore the stable carbon levels that are in our soil. And we've just taken our first payment for what some might call green offsetting, but we've just taken a payment out of some corporate body somewhere in the world for the practices that we do, which is our journey. And we've just proved ourselves to be net zero in terms of our arable land without counting our hedges and our grassland or anything. So actually what we're doing in the field is now there or thereabouts. It's a very close run thing, and it just depends on a lot of factors agronomically. But that'll do. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. What's your prop? What have you brought?
Okay, so of course I had to bring some soil. This will be about 6% organic matter, 3.5% carbon, which means we have about 95 to 100 tonnes of carbon in every hectare of our fields on average, and we have earthworms, and we probably have tardigrades with a bit of luck. Tardigrades, Mr. Hobson. I hope we have those, but I didn't want to bring just one. I wanted to bring 3 things. The other one was to bring some wood chip with mycorrhizal fungi on, because I believe we need to understand the entangled world. But I also brought some cherryade. Now, you may not want to pass that round, but it is not cherryade. It's actually red diesel for tractors. And the point I want to make is that with that product, We are able to intensively cultivate our soils, probably too much. It's currently 63 pence, 67 pence a litre, 63 and a bit pence a litre, I just bought that bit out. It used to be 10 pence a litre, but of course that's actually just over a litre in there. But every litre of that we burn is 2.5 kilos of carbon into the atmosphere. And it's the same almost for your heating oil and for your petrol. So we need to we need to reduce this, as you said. We need to get right and sort it out. It's a bit of a problem for tractors at the moment, but we also need to absorb that carbon into our soil. And there was a European study about 20 years ago that said if every arable farm in Europe went to no-till, we could absorb virtually all the emissions of Europe. Now, I don't study the numbers, but that says the magnitude to me of the problem. And the UK currently uses 90 million barrels of oil, the world uses 90 million barrels of oil a day. We're on 2 million barrels. You can calculate how much carbon that might be. So it's important in our heating, in our transport and all that. And so the answer to the question on the bottom here is to completely relocalize everything that we consume.
Well, as Glenn says, I think passing the red diesel around probably isn't such a good idea. But let's get the soil out there. And if anyone fancies untying that knot, I recommend smelling it and getting a real sense of it. Okay.
So just plant it somewhere?
Yeah, just plant it in the audience.
Literally.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Hello, I'm Becky Taylor. I helped set up and I work on Berry Farm, which is almost opposite in terms of scale to Glenn's. We have under our sort of care, I'd say 30 acres now, and we're a small mixed farm run on agroecological principles. We're also a cooperative. We're cooperatively owned and cooperatively run because we feel that part of our solution to all of the things we're facing is thinking about who has access to land, and perhaps one of the things we can talk about tonight is access and ownership of land. My prop is because it's out. I was terrified that everyone was going to bring apples in because it is obviously apple season, and I'm sure a number of you here have apple trees in your gardens. Lots of people do around here, and some of you may have orchards. So here's my prop. We were asked to have something that was both obvious and then reveal something surprising at the end. Okay, so the obvious thing, I mean, obviously, I wanted to impress you, okay? When we circulate this round, don't just look at these, pick them up, feel them, see how these are, we've got, I think, 15 different varieties of apples. We've got 30 on the farm. You might want to have a little game with yourself, see if there's ones that you can recognise and not. So it's partly about diversity, of course, but I also, for me, it's also about beauty. I want you to love these apples like I love these apples, because I think when we love something, we're willing to protect it. When it makes our hearts sing, we will go out and fight for it. And so for me, these apples and the land that I work is something that means a lot to me. And so the thing that I want you to see is the beauty, but as we're passing it round, I want you to also think what might be absent. And at the end, I'm going to talk about what absences I see in this basket. So that's me.
Richard, do you want yourself?
Hello, good evening. I'm Richard Symes. I have a 400-acre, essentially arable farm just 4 miles south of here at Bramfield. We are a modern, conventional, productive arable farm in many ways, but we've been increasingly using regenerative techniques, mainly no-till or low-till. We also have a significant nature area devoted to nature. Like Glenn was saying, we've restored ponds, we coppice woodland, we grow food for wild birds. The nature area on the farm is nearly 20% of the total farm. We have a small equine business where people keep their horses with us, and we're a small training establishment. And we also have a reasonably significant renewable energy business producing green electricity from a mix of solar and wind. The resulting combination of all those things is that we are net zero, or possibly now, having just increased that side of things a bit, slightly carbon negative, but we're certainly net zero. The climate problem can get a bit depressing for everybody, but I wanted to give you a bit of good news at the start, because I was taught to farm by going to university to start with. I was studying agriculture 50 years ago, hence the grey hair. Then we were taught to do all sorts of things that were appalling for the environment. Nobody had heard of climate change. Nobody would have had a climate conference in Halesworth. There certainly wouldn't have been a Green MP in Parliament. So actually, we've come a long way, and some things are actually getting better. So don't give up hope.
Brilliant.
My prop is actually a photograph. This is a picture of me in a field with a group of school children who have come from an inner city area. And I brought that because the climate problem is going to be a much bigger problem for them, not me. And I can't see many under 10-year-olds in the audience, not many under 20, but I'm sure you know plenty of people who are. But we mustn't forget the younger generation, and we must communicate with them from an early age about the problem that we have all got with this climate issue. So that's my prop.
I'm going to introduce myself briefly as well. I'm Josiah Meldrum, and I am a co-founder of a business called Hodmedods, which is based in Brampton, just outside Halesworth. We were in Halesworth for a while, but we actually started in Norwich, and we started by asking a straightforward question as a non-governmental organisation, which was, can Norwich feed itself? And if Norwich wanted to do that in a low input, less resource intense way that secured our future, what would that look like for diet and land use? And the answer really was quite a radical change to the food system as we see it today, both where we get our food from, but also how we produce that food. And we'll talk a little bit about more of that, I'm sure, over the evening. But the thing that really struck us during that project, the thing that really stood out as part of the solution is in this jar, or is part of what's in this jar, and that's beans and peas. Those fantastic crops that, by working with bacteria in the soil, can fix their own nitrogen, do not need synthetic nitrogen, but also leave some following crops. And as well as doing that, being less nitrogen intensive, because synthetic nitrogen is about 3.5–4% of man-made climate emissions, they're also really good for our health, and they're delicious. And so it's a really easy thing to do in order to affect some change, both in farming and in food. When we started with the pulses, we soon realised that there were other crops that we could fit in around those crops. Different types of cereals that have a better ability to adapt to the effects of climate change because of their genetic diversity. Seed crops that we're not currently growing, but that are much more nutrient dense than some of the other species that we grow currently. And that by starting with pulses and putting them into the middle of a rotation and into the middle of our plate, we can actually affect really, really broad change. They are essentially a systems change lever, a way of affecting change really, really broadly. And that by selling those pulses and creating a market for them, we would then create demand for farmers to produce more of them and to produce them in particular ways, and that would also improve our health. So it seems like a really obvious win-win-win. So my prop is, it's mostly beans and peas, but there are also lots of other seeds in there. And as it goes around, it's quite heavy, but and it's glass, maybe not a good idea, but as it goes round, I want you to do that village fete competition. I want you to see if you can guess how many seeds in the jar. I haven't bought a prize other than just the feeling of satisfaction if you get the closest number at the end. But also have a look and see if you can recognise any of the plant seeds that are in there. All of them have been grown in UK fields. So there will be some that you know very well, some that you've perhaps never seen before. There are some really, really tiny ones, so don't let those catch you out when you're counting. Anyway, that's me and that's my prop.
What I'd love to know, Josiah, is how long you spent counting them. Hello, I'm Stuart Mayhew, a farmer from Woodton. For context, I'm a converted farmer, I suppose. My previous life, as I now refer to it, was as EA Mayhew and Sons Limited, where we had a factory farm producing approximately 12,000 pigs a year, growing monoculture cereals to feed them on 500 acres. For a whole number of reasons, that came to a shuddering halt in 2015-16. And subsequently, my wife and I have changed tack slightly. She was a land agent by trade in a past life. We now are Old Hall Farm at Woodton. We have we feel a fantastic enterprise with around about 40 people as part of our team. We have a cow-calf dairy with 50 animals. We sell raw milk, we have a butchery, we have a shop, and we have a restaurant. Everything that we now produce off our farm is sold direct to a customer. It's been a fascinating journey. I've studied a lot more in the last 8 years than I ever did in my first life at university. I feel like I've probably earned a PhD. Maybe I'll take some time out sometime and do one. It's all about asking questions, and we've got to where we are now from a very, very different place by just simply asking questions. And one of the biggest problems we've found is that often people don't even know they need to ask questions, let alone what the right questions are. And that process for everybody is a journey, whether they are farmers, whether they are consumers, whatever business they're in. We're all connected to agriculture. We all have to eat. One of my biggest problems with this whole debate is often that people forget that actually we have to eat. That doesn't mean that farmers shouldn't do their absolute best, but there are lots of things that happen in the world that we don't actually have to do. We had a great discussion about this at lunch. Enough about me. I have brought a prop. There are a series of photos in this bag. They are in order, but don't worry if they get muddled up. But that is basically the food chain is in the bag, or the food chain on our farm is in that bag in a series of pictures, and it highlights everything you need to know. So I look forward to taking any questions about that afterwards.
Hello, Peter Hobson. I thought 3 weeks ago I'd actually retired and resigned my position as Professor of Biodiversity Conservation and Sustainability, only to find I walked out the door in glee and found myself walking through another door. And I now discover I'm Emeritus Professor at Anglia Ruskin. So I'm not sure retirement was on their mind as it was on mine. Anyway, so I am here now officially as an Emeritus Professor with the same chair. I hold a number of other positions. I'm on the IUCN Commission for Global Forests and Forest Ecosystems. That's my area of speciality. I'm also on the Climate Commission for Essex, and also sit on various commissions in Europe for beech forests, and also as a board of trustees for the Wilderness Foundation and Wild Europe. So I'm not sure retirement was ever going to be a prospect. Not that now I'm here, I think it was going to be one I'd know how to handle. my prop, I'm inclined not actually to explain it. I'd rather you had a pitch at it yourself. But what I will do is I'll give you a number of clues. So first, it's one important aspect of it is this sphere, and that it's split into two colours. That's quite significant. The other one is that it rolls around in this apparent basin. And the third clue is that this is a microcosmic version of the real thing. So all I can say is, think Gaia.
Brilliant, Peter, thank you. You really met the brief of having something quite cryptic that would be revealed at the end. So we're going to start the discussion proper, and thank you everyone for introducing yourselves so beautifully, and I think you can already see that we've got a real diversity of activities and interests and knowledge. What I'm going to ask, and what's going to happen next, is I'm going to ask Peter to essentially give us a bit of the bad news, give us a bit of the big picture, give us some of the local framing and the context, and then we're going to begin our wider discussion. I'm going to start off with the panel and ask them to respond to some of the things that Peter has said, how that affects them or what they're doing in their own lives and in their own businesses to address some of those issues or to respond to those issues. And then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. And I'm hoping that we'll have lots of questions and that there'll be a bit of a to and fro, both on the panel and possibly in the audience as well. I'm quite happy for it to be riotous. And I've asked Rachel to police it if it does get totally out of hand. So what I'm hoping is that we can explore the ideas. The original idea was that this should be like the Radio 4 programme, The Moral Maze. And if you're familiar with The Moral Maze, but essentially you have a panel that then interrogate a witness and then reflect on what that witness has said. That seemed like quite a challenging thing to do in this context. So we're going to try and have an approximation of it, but we're essentially going to be interrogating each other. And hopefully that will be elucidating and interesting and useful. So Peter, do you want to start with your big picture? Sure.
This spring, summer, I did my customary thing, which was to sort of drop all my official stuff and just go on a nature trek, a walkabout, as the Australians might call it, around my area, which is Rendon, just down the road there, of course. And I was picking up all the signs and signatures that have been hitting the news, which is, where are the butterflies, where are the insects? Broadly speaking, where is everything? And is it just this cold spring, this snap that the farmers have been complaining about, but then, of course, more widely across the environment? And, well, it's I've been looking, not in any empirical way, at certain taxonomic groups, and some of the big ones for me that are really worrying. I sort of think, well, butterflies, they're blousy, everybody looks at butterflies. But what about cuckoo spit? When did any of you actually find this clinging to your trousers when you walk through wet grass? They're not there. And there are many other indicators like this. And so this is something that's termed now the shifting baseline syndrome. Syndrome because a lot of the time we don't notice the incremental creeping loss of what's actually going on. And we formulate a new baseline the next year, and before we know it, we actually forget that we're no longer seeing squashed toads on the roads. And you think, but hang on a minute, 10 years ago, you were dodging them. And yet, where are they now? And equally, hedgehogs, all those sort of things. This is our creeping baseline syndrome. So what with this spring and state of nature, what is the bigger picture and what is going on? Well, Copernicus is an advisory organisation for the European Union. They use an awful lot of data from Potsdam Climate Centre, and they published just a few weeks ago that this summer, believe it or not, and particularly this August, is the hottest on record. Now, we heard those same sentiments last year and the year before, and so it goes on. So there is actually a steady change in one direction. It's not sort of going all over the place. Basically, the planet's heating up. So why did they pick on this particular year as something much, much more different from last? Well, because this August, we breached the 1.5 degrees. We've gone past it. And so the next question is, so what does that actually mean? Have we pushed through a barrier? Well, equally on top of this, there are other things that have been coming out. For the last 2 years, you will have picked it up on the news, the Mediterranean and North Africa are into their second year of severe drought. And Italy had lost more than 60% of its freshwater supplies, its reservoirs, as has Spain, so their crop production has declined dramatically. And so this is now sort of beginning to escalate into something very tangible that we're grappling with on a more of a day-to-day basis. So IPCC back in 23 came out with their report on Europe's agricultural system. And they pointed out, and I have it here, that over the last 50 years, crop losses tripled across Europe as a result of drought and extreme weathers. And this is almost now the new norm. This is an expectation that we're going to have to adapt to, because mitigate to it, we have not shown any evidence that we're capable of doing that on this scale. So we're looking to new principles of coping with these extreme climates. Equally, on the same front, we heard it just a little earlier, nature is inextricably linked to all of these issues and problems. So when we see that the state of nature indicates that last year we saw a 78% decline in insects across the UK, this is an alarm bell on a magnitude that we can't yet really come to grips with. Me as an ecologist and a systems thinker, I'm trying to piece it all together. Too complex, no point doing this. So where does food come into all of this? And why was this talked about so much at COP28? Well, food systems. I'm going to be careful in my language here. Not specifically food production, but food systems. The whole chain still contributes about 1/3 to greenhouse gas emissions. Now that, if we stick with business as usual, that will not change by 2050, whatever mitigation measures we put in. So this is sort of tasking us with a new look. And so if you want to see the figures, and if you want to get a sense of the world angst on this, then you ought to be digging into the World Economic Forum reports. They're published every year. This year's reports come out, and for the last 5 years, the top 4 key issues are all environmental, not economic, environmental, in terms of influence on our society and impact. So these are considered the highest risks. These are extreme weathers. This is climate change, not being able to read precisely what's happening because we can no longer predict it. We can only just observe what's going on. Every time we remodel it in IPCC, that model is broken down because new boundaries have been broken through in terms of weather, temperatures, all those, and speed of ice melt, all those sort of things. So, which foods then are considered to be some of the troublesome areas? And I know there's been much debate about this, but if we just take a general sweep global picture, you could say that the forerunners in all of this are anything and everything to do with animal food production. So, however you want to cut it, whether you want to break it down into dairy, whether you want to cut it down into beef, or any of those, it is basically the big chunk of that CO2 or that greenhouse gas emissions comes from animal food production. And at the moment, we do not see that slowing down globally. If anything, it's increasing. So we have got to come to a point very quickly and urgently as a society, and I'm talking about a world society, in terms of what are we eating and how much of that should we be eating, and what is the payoff or the cost load to the planet. Because at the moment, the cost of agricultural systems across the world to society and to the environment far exceeds the GDP earning of agricultural production and economy, far exceeds it. So in other words, there is a decrease in the capacity of the planet to supply the necessary ecosystem services to actually provide this food in the first place. So, rebooting. This is, are there solutions to this? We will have to fundamentally reboot our relationship with nature. Because at the moment, we're on the wrong trajectory. We have treated it as an economic commodity. It is not. We are intrinsic part of that biodiversity across the planet. And so if we sink it, we go with it. There is no debate about that. It's quite simple. And don't look for a spare seat on the next mission to Mars, because Mars has nothing to offer. That's the bottom line, whether it's with Elon Musk or anybody else. So we need a fundamental shift in our social logic. We need to be going for a one health. That's climate health, that's our own personal health, and that is the health of nature. And this is a change in social logic. And also, finally, we need to be getting much more eco-centered in how we deal and treat the land. We need to be entering into a shared partnership with nature. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. That was fantastic. That was a great overview, and it captured some of the big kind of philosophical questions. You know, this Enlightenment idea of our separation of ourselves from nature. You know, which was an ongoing and long-term process that happened through what you might broadly call civilization, but it led to the point where we separated ourselves very consciously from nature and natural processes, and that put us in this extractive position, which I think has led us to this problem that we find ourselves in now. And re-embedding ourselves in the ecosystems that we entirely depend upon is the critical work of the next 40 years, I would suggest. And that, in a way, is what we should be discussing tonight. There are a couple of questions that emerge from that, which I'm going to put to the panel, and I'm going to ask you to respond to them as briefly as you can. And I know that some of them don't necessarily demand a brief reply. But I think the first question I'm going to ask you all is, within the farming context within which you work, and referring to the sort of shifting baseline and the change that we've had happening over time, within your farming lifetimes, have you seen and felt the effect of climate change in the work that you do every day? Just as Richard, briefly, is that something that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
You want a brief answer?
Yeah. And how's that manifested itself in your planning and in the way in which your farm operates?
Well, the climate, the weather has changed, and it's getting more difficult. We are seeing more longer runs of very wet weather, longer runs of very dry weather, a lack of longer runs of wet weather, followed by long runs of very dry weather, almost a complete absence of snow and frost in the winter. We see the climate changing. I've seen nature change, and we are trying to give more space for nature, but it has changed for the worse, probably, although there are signs of some things now coming back, but it's maybe a forlorn hope. I read worryingly about reports that by 2100 there may not be any farming in East Anglia, and that is slightly worrying. well, more than slightly worrying. I'll be dead by then, so it's slightly worrying to me.
So Richard, you told me before we came into the room that you'd been farming in the same place for 50 years, and you obviously have that longer perspective. Becky, I'm going to come to you and ask you, in a much shorter spell, how long have you been? You've been on your land for 10 years?
20. We've had it 20 years next year, but
Okay.
we've been doing something that we can plausibly call farming for maybe 15.
Okay.
I think would be fair. Yeah, Hayley's at the back nodding to me there. I think it's, Richard, what you're saying about those longer periods. So, we've got used to thinking of British weather as being changeable. But I think one of the things that's happened is that what we have is a fixed period. So rather than it being sunny for a few days and then raining for a few days and all the rest of it, last year, or from this time last year till like July, it basically rained, right? There was the odd little bit where it didn't, but we have these much longer fixed periods, or when we had that drought 2 years ago when we basically didn't have rain for 4 months, and the kinds of things, because I'm old enough that people, when I was growing up, would talk about the summer of 1976 and that being 6 weeks without rain. And actually, I think we've come to starting to think that kind of thing's much more normal. And for us, we've, for a few years, we're like, oh, we're used to these cold, dry springs, but then we've ended up having, some wetter springs. And so we try to deal with this, and I'm imagining other people, by diversifying the number of crops that we grow and growing increasing numbers inside as well as outside to try and mitigate and smooth those variations that we're having, because we don't know what's going to happen. But then because our irrigation comes through our reservoir and then we run out of water, or because we're having to irrigate, so it's still, I think what we're seeing is that unpredictability. And just this last week when I've been harvesting my gorgeous apples, it's been a complete nightmare because of the wind and the rain. You want it to be dry, you want it to be still, and that's not what we've had. And there's, I want to pick them when they're in peak condition, but I'm a bit like, well, should I actually just pick them now, even though they haven't had the sun, perhaps earlier on in a season, just so that we get a crop, even if it doesn't taste as good? Do we give up with the ideal just so that we have something, is one of the questions I've started asking myself.
Indeed. I mean, I think, obviously, it is, I'm sure the audience are aware, it's the farmer's prerogative to complain about the weather, but it has become exceptional. We work with about 35 farmers all over the UK, and they're growing arable crops, and the planting times have become incredibly unpredictable, and the success of those crops has become very unpredictable. Planting last autumn was incredibly difficult, and if things were planted, they often haven't done very well this year. Wheat yields might be down 25, 26%. And that's a problem for us, and it's a problem for everyone in this room. And yet, interestingly, that doesn't yet seem to have been particularly well reflected in the future prices for wheat. I don't know why that is. Glenn, you, in your role as a county coordinator for the NFU, are you seeing that from the farmers that you're engaging with?
Absolutely. So
It's definitely working. There you go.
yeah. Yeah, it needs some wheels, really. Yeah. So the role for the NFU is to represent the industry to your MPs, to society, and I'm slightly an outlier in the NFU. I congratulated them when they suggested that we have a 2040 target for agriculture for net zero. When SFI was being questioned, this is a sustainable farming incentive that the government has launched, and Michael Gove was the architect with Dieter Helm. We actually had an NFU council. We represent the county at NFU council nationally, and there was an ask for a pause in these sustainable incentives. I was the only member of that council to stand up and say, you cannot pause. There are too many issues here that need to be dealt with, and we've got to do it. And so, yes, absolutely. In Bedfordshire, we've got members on our regional board who are reporting today. They've had 9 inches of rain in the last 3 weeks. One farmer said he's got 24 tonnes of seed left in stock to sow from last year because he couldn't sow in the autumn. And he's now saying it may be the same problem for me again. So I made a lot of notes a little while ago, just now, on all the comments. The farmers, we are at the front line of this climate problem and trying to grow food and run a business. And it is becoming, I would suggest, increasingly difficult to maintain yield and quality. Really.
Yeah, very much so. Stuart, you're in an interesting position in some respects in that you've gone through a transition really in the last few years. Part of that is about adaptation, I'm guessing. Oh, is it not loud enough? Can you hear me?
What about the roving mic?
Yeah, can we... I'll switch off my...
Going on at the back that you're unaware.
Oh, okay. I was going to move to the roving mic.
There's some manipulation going on at the back.
Yeah.
There are two sound systems going on. Could you leave it to us?
Okay.
Shout louder.
I'll shout louder. Stuart, you moved into broadly what you might describe as regenerative farming from a more intensive model over the last decade or so. Partly, I'm guessing, is a sort of response to this, an adaptation strategy. Despite that, are you still seeing the impacts of climate change or of variability in the weather?
So, certainly all farmers can tell you that, yes, the weather patterns are changing and are making life more difficult. I think one of the things that farmers have forgotten, and it's a phrase I've heard before but not really thought about for ages, is shifting baseline syndrome. The simple fact is that we have, by and large, knackered our greatest resource, which is our soils. Every time I now drive past a bare, cultivated field, it actually makes me a little bit sad inside. And that is a change of mindset that I have been blessed and cursed with, because now I cannot unsee things that I know the consequences of them. It's why we no longer do any cultivation on our farm. We have to be smarter, we have to be cleverer, we have to do different things. Now, clearly, not cultivating your farm is not going to make any difference if you get 6, 7, 8 inches of rain. You're still stuffed. But our carrying capacity, we have eroded it over the last 50, 60, 70, 100 years. And every time anybody goes past a bare, cultivated field, well, it should be illegal. We need to find a different food system. It's as simple as that. And until we address that issue, I'm afraid our ability to deal with the increased variation in the weather is going to continue to go down.
Yeah, it is. I think I was going to ask one more question, which I don't think I'll do actually, because I think it's one that's quite contentious, and it will take a lot of time answering this particular question. I was going to ask you what we should be eating, what you think we should be eating, what that should look like, what that diet that Peter was suggesting should really look like. For me, it's less meat, significantly less meat, a lot less pork and poultry, and a lot more beans. That probably doesn't surprise you overly. But I sense that if we open that discussion to the panel, we might have a longer conversation. I'd quite like to get some audience participation and start getting some questions out there so that we can be a little bit less didactic. Rachel's got the mic. Rachel, can I just let you choose people?
Oh, no.
So raise your hand if you have any... Yeah, there we are, look, that was easy. We've got a question towards the back.
I thought you were going to let
Hang on, wait for the mic.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
I would hold it like an ice cream. Right. As Stuart just vividly pointed out, it seems to me there is a solution which is being promoted and quite wisely, and that is to put much more resources into factory production of protein with bacteria and fungi. They one of the major ways we've got to go.
Brilliant. So this is a really interesting question. Before you take the mic away, Rachel, I'm just going to ask: is this have you read George Monbiot's book Regenesis?
No, I haven't. But
It's a strong feature in his argument of how we need to change farming and food production is that we'll use a lot more, essentially, fermentation processes in order to produce protein. So in fact, we have come back to the question of what should we be eating. So I am going to ask the rest of the panel what they think their diet should be made up of. And I'd be really interesting to hear what role you think cultivated meat on the one hand, but also these products of fermentation might have in that future diet. I'm going to go to you first, Stuart, because I sense that you have a lot to say on this, but try and keep it
I can actually respond to this really quickly. Originally, when this sort of idea has been first muted, I was very anti. But when you think about things, and we all should think about things constantly, all of the time, and ask questions and challenge ourselves. And I've come to the conclusion that I personally don't think people should necessarily eat McDonald's and chicken nuggets. But do you know what? People do. And they're not going to stop doing that. And that's exactly where there is a role for this sort of food. If it needs to replace the parts of our food system that are causing the most amount of damage. And there are some really obvious, easy wins there that could happen. So I have gone from being pretty much totally anti to saying, actually, yes, I think this probably has a good role to play. The only thing I do question, because I don't quite understand, is where the feedstock for this always comes from. And a lot of the sort of foods that are currently being muted, the feedstock is still coming from pretty dubious farming systems. So that's my only question. There you go, that was brief.
That's So I think the parts of the food system that you were particularly thinking about there was, and I'm sure we're all aware of this, that 50% of the cereal crops we drive past in the fields in East Anglia are likely as not going to go and feed mostly pigs and chickens. And in the UK, we consume we kill about 1 billion chickens a year for meat. We don't actually eat all of that chicken, ironically. Some of it we export. And we import 3 million tonnes of soya to feed to those chickens and those pigs. And that has a huge impact, particularly in the Brazilian Amazon. So those are the parts of the food system you're talking about, I think, in terms of what we need to address. Glenn, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I hear the argument clearly, and I concur. Do you know? I think actually, if we should stop eating pork and chicken. The chicken that you're eating is egg to dead in 35 days. It's artificially boiler houses, is fed with grain. But many grain farmers are so dependent on that part of the food system, and it's cheap. And the argument also is, if you look at carbon footprint for these products, you find that chicken is at the bottom. So you have to sum up all the arguments. I actually prefer to think that we should probably be eating beef and sheep, utilising the leather and the wool, using clover to graze the land, and actually have a landscape where there are dung beetles and insects. So I would throw that into the argument, and would like to see a removal, or in a way, which is completely going to upset many a farmer, of that. But someone needs to do the science, or change society's demands, and probably change society's demands away from cheap food and spending just 8 or 9% of your income on food, and eating quality food, and supporting local production and consumption, and starting to think about the circular economy that perhaps can be gone through all of that. But of course there'll be people who don't want to eat animals, and they'll be called sentient beings, but they want to kill crops and eat them. So, there you go, they live.
Becky, can I go to you next, Becky? Because I'm possibly going to out you as a vegan.
You can out me as a vegan, that's totally fine.
But you have a very complex position on this, I think, and it would be interesting to hear about that, and also your view on cultivated meats and where that sits within that kind of ethical frame.
I mean, personally, if I talk about veganism, really boring, but okay, for the purposes of answering this, you know, I'm not an evangelical vegan by any stretch of the imagination. I've been vegan for about 30 years, and I think for me it's interesting the decisions that I think about as a producer compared to as a consumer, because I think that if you live in the city, you don't have access to growing your own food or very easy access to very many ethical foods, then an easy way to think about being ethical is being vegan. If you don't have many choices, then that's something that you can do, and it's a relatively simple thing for people to do. And I think in a world where people feel really disempowered and they feel that they can take some kind of ownership and control over some small thing where they can feel they can make a difference, I think that's an important thing. The farm that we have at Bury Farm, we keep cattle. We've kept pigs in the past, we've kept chickens in the past, and as a vegan in the co-op, because it's a co-op, I could have blocked that decision. But I've chosen not to do that, because for me, partly it's about, you know, as you work in a cooperative, in the same way as a parent in a family, you sometimes make decisions which you don't think are great for you, but you think they benefit the rest of the family, or in this sense, the co-op. And I can see that there's, you know, everyone else, apart from one other person in the co-op, they eat meat. They're going to get that meat from somewhere. Isn't it better that our meat comes from the farm rather than from a factory farm or from intensive pig farming down at the bottom of the village or whatever? So, and the cattle that we have on the farm, we integrate them into, and so we have them primarily for land management. So in fact, we've for the last, I think, 15 years now, we've had some kind of large-scale rotation system whereby we grow vegetables on 2 blocks out of 6 in any one year, and then we have the cattle grazing, and we also make hay on other fields as well, and we move that around, so we don't actually add very much nutrient value to the areas that we crop the vegetables on for 2 years, because in the 4.5 years it's building up nutrients through both the lay and the cattle. However, picking up on the point there, we're sort of starting to think, well, what about, you know, thinking increasingly about no-till. We've been trying to think about, you know, what do we do if we have a system where we've been trying to reduce the number of inputs that we have coming into the farm. So we haven't been wanting to import loads of compost in order to have a large-scale no-dig system. Now it feels that actually having the cattle, the bedding, and through grass that we're cutting and various other things, that we might actually be building up enough nutrients to be able to sort of have the compost to have a no-dig. So cattle in that sense is an integral part of a system whereby, you know, apart from lemons and tomato puree, actually all my fruit and vegetables come from the farm, and lots of beans, because we grow beans also for Hodmedods as well as for our veg boxes too. And so I feel like I can have a lot of my diet, but not all of it comes from the farm, and I'm really happy with that. And I just wanted to pick up, so for me, I think the 2 things about being vegan is I don't think there is a right answer. We live in a messy, complicated world, which is increasingly messier and more complicated, and I think there are different ways of navigating through that. So I think people having really strong opinions over being vegan or not vegan is not very helpful, because there's lots of, you know, decisions in different parts of the world make really big differences, as well as you as a person, and all sorts of different things, cultural things, and all the rest of it. So I don't think there is a right answer. I think the answer that we have globally at the moment is very much a wrong answer. And so the 2 things I wanted to pick up on was first from the gentleman's question. It's my concern is around the global systems being messed up. And in the same way that 20 years ago I was opposed to GM, not necessarily because of the science, because I'm not a scientist and I'm not an expert, but because if you have a few big companies controlling seed and chemical production, I don't think that's a good idea, because they don't have a great track record. And it's the same thing now, that it's not just where the things are coming from, but who is controlling our food systems. And the more localised and the more diverse those food systems are, the safer we are, quite frankly, apart from anything else. During COVID, you know, suddenly when all the food systems started breaking down, we were inundated with inquiries for our veg boxes. The problem is, of course, is that you can't in April crop vegetables that you didn't plant in September or you didn't store for over winter. So we need long-term, we need sustainable, we need local food systems that are diverse, and that diversity, as far as I'm concerned, it's about soil, it's also about having animals in there where that's appropriate. I don't have a hard line over that, but what I don't want to see is big corporations controlling the majority of our food, and that's where I think we go really wrong.
Well, my own diet has changed over my lifetime, and I now eat far less meat than I used to, but I'm not yet vegan.
You don't have to be.
I have read George Monbiot's Genesis. I've also read Henry Dimbleby's book, and quite a lot of stuff by Dieter Helm. One of the statistics that came out of Dimbleby's book was that 80% of our nutrition comes from just 20% of the land, which means that 80% of the land is actually being used very inefficiently to feed us. And that is largely because of meat production. We, almost entirely, we could actually feed ourselves on less than half the land. We could then devote half the land to nature. That would soak up a huge amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. That is the best way to actually get carbon into the soil, is to leave it alone and stop farming it altogether and stop taking anything off it. It would have huge benefits for our health, and the nation's health was never better than it was in the Second World War, when meat products were heavily rationed and we were eating a far more vegetarian diet with a little bit of meat and milk and butter. So that would reduce the demands on the health service and have all sorts of other benefits. So I totally agree. Meat production is a problem. The problem farmers have is that they are running a business, and that is about earning a living, making some money, and if it is profitable to produce meat because people will buy it and pay a lot of money for it, farmers will produce it because that just makes commercial sense. So that is the conundrum that you have to stop. And the answer to that probably comes down to money and economics, but that might be to do with another question further on.
So I think in answering a question about fermentation, we've ended up addressing questions about perhaps technological fixes and whether we actually need to effect a cultural shift rather than just finding a substitute for the thing that we're eating, that we need to think systemically about how our food is produced, and that might mean making some difficult choices at times. Certainly with the Norwich project, when we were looking at the best system for producing food on the edge of Norwich, one of the conclusions we came to was very similar to Becky's, and that was that livestock on a very small scale are actually quite an important part of nutrient cycling, of accelerating the availability of nutrients in the soil from lay crops, but also from eating what you might call co-products. You could call them waste, but there's no waste in farming and food systems. That's a thing that happens at home and after they've been processed. But things like beans, for example, that don't meet human consumption grade, it makes sense to feed those to livestock, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to grow wheat explicitly for those livestock. Yeah. Just coming back to the fermentation question, Peter, and I don't, this is outside of your expertise, I'm sure, but I'd be interested to know if you if you have any experience with that within the sort of systems thinking that you've been looking at and the way you've been thinking about an adjustment to food systems. Is fermentation something that's on your radar?
I was actually hoping to answer the question really about how much meat should we be eating,
yeah,
and where do we come from for that. So if you don't mind if I hijack that one from fermentation to that. So I know a bit more about that. So 2019, the Lancet Commission, which was made up of 78 of the world's top scientists, published a seminal piece of work where they set out very clearly the impact of our food system on our health and the environment and the climate. And so it goes something like this. They calculated, based on WHO data and more, far beyond that, metadata that floats around there in the clouds. They calculated that on average, across the globe, human beings as a species are consuming 260% more red meat than they need to physiologically to stay healthy. Not 50%, 260%. So if you tie that to the environment, what sort of impact has that had on our planet over the last 30, 40 years? Well, there's another statistic that has come out from a similar report, which goes like this, that if you were to weigh every single mammal on this planet, every species, from whale to shrew, and include human beings and livestock, 96% of that total biomass weight is made up by 4 breeds of animals, none of them wildlife. So only 4% of the entire world is now occupied by wild meat. That gives you some idea of how we have shifted the systems towards a meat consumption even beyond our physiological boundaries, meaning our needs. And on top of that, it comes with a heavy price on water. So already we have breached the planetary boundary on green water, which means we're abstracting more than precipitation is providing for the planet. So 70% of all fresh water goes into irrigation. If you were to take one product globally, I'm not sort of saying, oh yes, but you know, I'm on an organic pastoral farm and those figures don't square up. If we take a global picture, then it actually costs, in terms of a literage of water, 21,000 litres of fresh water to produce a kilogram of red meat. So the question then is, at what point does planet Earth dry up and all of its natural capital diminish to such a point that the entire system goes into collapse? And yet physiologically, we don't need to eat that much red meat. The Lancet Commission have made that really clear. So I would say we really are on the wrong trajectory. And they have put it out there that we would need to reduce our meat consumption, meaning red meat specifically, by 50% per person. So that is a benchmark that they're giving us. They've put it out there. They're giving it to us. They're telling us that's what we should be doing in order to stay really healthy and to ensure a healthy planet.
Before we go back to the audience, I'm going to quickly offer Stuart an opportunity to give a perspective from a regenerative farmer and perhaps that organic low-input farmer that you were suggesting, Peter, and what your take on that is.
It's really interesting, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you started, because it does become about equality of food, and the simple fact is that not all farming systems are the same, and averages are really useful, but they also tar everybody with the same brush. We discussed earlier that my sister-in-law and I, on average, take 15 flights a year each. In reality, I haven't been on a plane in 10 years. But I think the key is the food. It does come back to changing the food system. My concern is in our little neck of the woods, we've changed our farming system into one that doesn't have any inputs. Other than drinking water, my cows, the rest of the water to grow their food falls out of the sky. Whether the cows are there or not is immaterial. It does make our food very expensive compared to what you can go and buy in a supermarket. And I think this is where it comes down to equality of food to individuals. If everyone turned up at our farm tomorrow, we wouldn't have enough anyway. But a lot of people would say on our budget they couldn't afford our milk, which is, if anyone doesn't know, it's £2.50 a litre. So this is for milk. If you went to a supermarket, you could buy it significantly cheaper. When we are now asked, why is our milk so expensive, we actually turn around and say, that's the wrong question. The question is, why is that other milk so cheap? And I won't apologise. We don't apologise. It's like, well, if you don't want it, don't buy it. There are externalities in our farming system. Obviously, we're not perfect, but we think we've covered most of them that is in our power to do. That is one of the reasons why our milk and meat is so expensive. And that's probably part and parcel of getting people to eat less meat, is looking at the price. But I also don't think that people should be disadvantaged because of their income levels or social background, or just simply where they live, from having access to good, nutritious food. That, coming back to the original question, is maybe where these alternative protein sources, maybe that is where they all start to play a part. So it is really complicated.
Definitely is. Have we got any more questions about the complexity? Hands up. We've got a couple. One right in the back row. Gentleman with the red jumper on. I think you were fastest.
Question primarily, I think, for Professor Hodgson, and we kind of hinted at it. You mentioned earlier that I think you said 30% of CO2 emissions come from food production worldwide. Does that include the shipping of food around the world? Because, I mean, what I'm leading on to is, it seems to me there's a big problem with globalisation, particularly with regard to food. And that leads on to the concept that we need to get back to eating seasonally the things which grow naturally much closer to home and greatly reducing our food miles, which then have double benefits. There'll probably be some benefits from food production, but certainly in terms of food transport, it is very expensive in terms of air and sea travel, which are huge producers of CO2. It's all bound up together. But, and we kind of hinted at it in passing, we haven't addressed it specifically.
Yeah, you may recall at the very, very beginning of my introduction, prior to the sort of opening up to the floor, I said I'm going to choose my words carefully here. I'm not talking about food production, I'm talking about the food system. And the reason for that is that we measure CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions across the entire system from field to plate. And so if you then say, right, okay, where is production within that total 30%, it's about 65% of the emissions comes from production. So there's plenty of room there for scaling down, but then it doesn't take the pressure off the post-harvest aspect of food management to do exactly the same. And it's an entirely integrated system thinking process. It comes down to energy, it comes down to everything that you talked about. Mileage, transportation, the whole lot.
Brilliant. Got a question right at the back. Oh, you've got one there. Oh, sorry, I'm obscured by the pillar.
Thank you very much. Can I ask, how do you feel about the current rural policy, farming and rural policy, and what would you like to see the government do about it?
Brilliant.
Ben, this is coal-face stuff for you. What's the NFU pushing for? What do you personally hope that this government will achieve?
Is there even a ZERF at the moment? What is the policy?
So we go back to the post-Brexit, post-Europe policy we have now, started by Michael Gove and Dieter Howell. So the incentives are to be more sustainable. But what we've not done, or what's not happening, is we are not decentralising the food system. So it's actually attempting to make a monocultural system more sustainable, which one could argue isn't going to achieve anything, or not significant things. And the other thing that we have in rural policy, if you like, is the stewardship schemes, and we have things like clusters. I don't belong to a cluster, I'm being begged to belong to a cluster. I would sooner belong to a food cluster, because I believe if you do the local food diverse landscape, you will bring your nature back better than worrying about sowing quinoa or buckwheat, which are strange non-native plants to our bird species and other such things that are going on. So why are we thinking we should be thinking food first and local, cutting down on the need for this? So I suggested two numbers just now. One was that it's 100, I reckon, unirrigated wheat is 147 litres of water can give you a kilo of wheat. And also, I looked up the other week about food miles, and apparently the website that does this stuff suggests that most food products are travelling 1,500 miles. So let's just take that carbon cost out of the system and decentralise, take the corporate powers, we just talked about the supermarkets, and also the advertising agencies, you know? I mean, people are just telling people who don't think to buy things that they shouldn't probably be buying, not knowing the externalities of this consumption that goes on, as per one of Peter's colleagues, Jules Pretty, wrote in his book, Agriculture 20 Years Ago.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point, and I think certainly in our work with the pulses and grains and seeds, when we connect eaters of food, consumers as you might call them, because that's what eating is, except consumer is a very loaded word which suggests a very passive position, that when you connect those people with where their food has been grown, even if it is broadly what you might call a commodity, a crop that is usually traded globally and where the unit of measure is a 28-ton truck, that as soon as you connect people to that food, they have a very different relationship with it. So a farmer will move from producing a commodity that could be bioethanol, it could be animal feed, it could be going for milling, but they don't necessarily know what the trader's going to do with it. Suddenly it becomes a food crop. That changes the farmer's relationship, in our experience, with that crop. It changes the eater's relationship with that crop. And that really drives change quickly. We've seen farms that we've worked with for 10 years entirely and totally transformed by their relationship with crops that they'd previously not really taken much notice of. And that has encouraged them to think about local markets, about direct sales for crops that would otherwise have been treated as commodities. The challenge we face in East Anglia, I think, and we'll come to this in a minute, is that farms are large. And if you've got 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres, and you're producing mostly wheat, you're not going to sell that at the farmer's market. And we do not have routes to market that allow us to move those foods into local sales. More to the point, East Anglia has a responsibility to feed the rest of the UK, to feed those urban conurbations, to feed the 83% of the population, roughly speaking, that is now classed as urban dwelling. And so we need to find ways of connecting people with where their food has come from and how it's been produced. And I think we have the technology to do that now, and I think we have the will and the means to do it. But if we were to do that, we could have quite a transformation. Becky, you're on quite a small scale, and you have those very direct relationships with your customers. Does that shape how you work your farm?
You can say no.
I don't know, because we've always done it like this, so it's almost like we can't establish the counterfactual. We grow things, and we are lucky we've got not just you, but we have other customers, next customers in the audience tonight. And what we try to do is we sell things both direct through our veg boxes, and because of the diversity of crops that we have, going back to thinking about the precarity that we now exist within, one of the things about having veg boxes is if we have a catastrophic fail, like last time I saw Josiah was at the beginning of May, and I was about to say, hey, we've just finished our old potatoes and you'll be getting new potatoes next week. We had rats going through, and we grow them in the polytunnel, we had rats going through and ate 85% of our new potatoes over a course of 2 or 3 days. And that, going back to climate change, I suspect what that was, because we've never had rats normally rats aren't that bothered about potatoes, they might eat them in the middle of winter if they're really cold and hungry, but they're not in May. But I think because it was such a warm year, such a warm winter, they'd carried on breeding. They got to May, there were loads of rats, and they didn't have anything to eat, so they ate our potato. But the point is because we grow lots of other things, we're able to mask those losses to an extent. And we just put different things in the veg boxes. So rather than relying on one big crop, we have lots of different things, and we, put in something else. And you probably got extra salad or something, I can't remember. But anyway, all the strawberries. But so we do. One of the things that we do is that, and I think that when people buy from us, what they're doing is they know that everything that we grow is produced on the farm. We always encourage people to come and visit, and I'll take time out and show people around. We'll have a chat, and people, I hope, feel that although we're not certified organic, that we're utterly transparent in how we produce, and we're really happy for people to come and visit. We host school visits. We encourage people to come and have that kind of connection. And I think that works for some people, but for me, no offence, but I don't want to spend all my life growing vegetables for lovely middle class people. For me, there's also a social justice element. I believe that everybody should have the right to decent quality food. We do currently supply to what you could call food banks, the community larder here and the Beccles Academy free shop. Isn't it awful that we exist in a society which is still the 5th biggest economy in the world, and we have food banks, and we have to get funding through the lottery to help subsidise our providing of the food banks. I would like to live in a world where the food that I'm producing gets shared in and gets used within the local community. Really, I live in Ilkleshall St Andrew. We should just produce the vegetables for Ilkleshall St Andrew, and somebody else's farm can do other places. As it is, we deliver within the Beccles, Bungay, Halesworth triangle, and that is seen as being very local, and particularly compared to the 1,500 miles average sort of food thing, that is local, and I think people do have a connection and feel a connection with that farm. But we don't make enough money. People won't pay enough.
Coming back to the policy question, I mean, horticulture historically has received no direct support. You're more than just horticulture, but how might policy support you in order to make a proper living, supply that food locally, and allow greater accessibility to what it is that you're producing? What needs to change?
Okay, so I think area-based payments, which helped even more turn land into a commodity that was being bought up by big finance companies, those should certainly be removed, because just being paid to be rich, over and above a certain amount. The Land Workers Alliance is a small kind of guild of agroecological farmers, which we're part of, and there's a number of farmers in the local area who are part of that, and the research that they have done around horticulture, because horticulture, and particularly the kind of horticulture that we do, which is only semi-mechanised, is very labour intensive. And we can't afford, if we do pay people at least the minimum wage, we wouldn't be able to sell our vegetables for what they cost. What the Land Workers Alliance research has suggested is, and in fact both the Welsh and Scottish governments have started talking about this, is having a basic income for horticultural producers. So you're guaranteed X amount of income per year, you know, whether it's 15 grand or 20 grand, whatever it is. And if you earn more than that, then that's great, you're earning some more money, but actually it takes away the disadvantages, because a lot of horticultural enterprises tend to be small in terms of land area. And so with the schemes that we've had over the last few years, which have been based, where subsidies have been based on how much land you have, if you've got 1,000 acres, you get loads of money, and you might only need 3 people to farm that, whereas if you've got 20 acres and you're trying to produce horticultural products intensively, actually you might need 40 people to work on that. And so to think about shifting the subsidy to where it reflects the work that's done, and also changing the planning system, because at the moment, if you want to work in agriculture and you're not fortunate enough to have born into a farming family and inherited a farm, if you want to actually be able to buy some land, you know, we all know that, you know, a farm's broken up and you have your big farmhouse for 3 acres with pony paddocks that's sold off to some rich person, and then the rest of it is then bought up by a big finance company and is used and is, you know, farmed perhaps by a contract farmer or something like that. And actually it's really difficult to get into the farming system, and it's only because of help of Paul Watkins, who's over there, who made a connection for us, that we were able to buy the land that we bought off the open market. And so in fact at the moment, and then we had land but we couldn't live on it, and then it was very difficult to do any particular levels of farming because we needed to be there to do the things. It took us 10 years to get planning permission with an agricultural tie for one house. We just had planning permission tied down for a eco-dwelling one-person unit because it was, quotes, too small and didn't fit with the minimum, you know, size requirements. And so there's actually no joining up of the system. You know, Suffolk likes to think, you know, it brands itself as the greenest county, but it doesn't think about the things that it might be able to do to enable people who want to work on the land to actually be able to work on the land. I'll stop ranting now.
So broadly, policy's done nothing for you and you don't hold out much hope.
I mean, everything that we've achieved has been despite of government policy.
Yeah, and so you end up with a self-selected group of people who either can afford to do that activity or live in absolute poverty, essentially, in order to achieve that end.
Or a heady mixture of the two.
Yeah. Richard, coming to you, and again, addressing the policy issue, you are part of one of those clusters, I think, that
maybe somebody wants to explain what the cluster is for people who don't know.
A cluster group is essentially something that's emerged over the last 5 or 6 years. It's often led or driven by the wildlife trusts or by local organisations, but it's basically farmer-led, and the idea is that a group of farmers come together to share knowledge, to think about how they might affect change at landscape scale, so beyond the boundaries of their farm gate, and how they might engage with their local communities a bit more. But Richard can probably say a lot more about that than me. You're part of the Blyth Valley cluster, am I right?
I lead the Blyth Valley cluster. I'm actually back here tomorrow talking about clusters. So I'm hoping you're all going to be back here tomorrow morning when I will talk about clusters. We are trying to make a difference locally. It is at small scale. It is funded partly by some government funding. But the question was bigger and wider than that, about government policy. And I mean, I totally agree what has been said already in this answer, but I want to take this question in a slightly different direction, because the government really is the key to solving the problem of climate change, the problem of agriculture, the awful problems that were outlined at the beginning. And the government has the responsibility and the ability to make real change if it would or it could. And they are slightly different things. I read a headline in the news a day or so ago about Germany, where the government was saying agriculture ought to pay for its emissions. It should be charged a tax on its polluting emissions. And I thought, actually, everybody and every industry should be taxed on the damage they are doing to the climate. And I'm not alone in that thought, because that came to me by reading the work of the Professor of Economics, Dieter Helm, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Oxford. And if government would tax what is bad and not tax or even subsidise what is good, it would affect a huge change. And one of the interesting things I read on that was, why on earth do we tax income? I guess most people here pay income tax. Income, Dieter Helm said, is a good thing. Nothing wrong with income. The problem is what you spend it on. And if you buy fossil fuel, Glenn's litre of diesel costs him 60 pence or whatever it was. What he doesn't pay for is the cost of the damage that does to the climate. And if there was a real government policy to tax what is bad, I don't think you would see asparagus from Peru in the supermarket, because currently the aviation fuel has no tax at all, not even the same tax as our petrol or diesel. And so government policy is actually the key to the whole problem.
So I'm going to...
Implementing it.
So the challenge is...
I'm not a politician, and I see our politician has dashed out of the room quickly before I've got to this point, because it's his job to try and implement something like that, but he's disappeared, which I think is a great pity, but that's what politicians do. They escape all the different issues. But there you are. Pass it on.
So I think some really fantastic points about how progressive taxation can affect change really quickly, and how sometimes very simple policy measures can make really big differences in ways that we don't expect. So for example, a good example, which isn't related to anything that we're talking about, but is an example of a tiny change that makes a big difference, is that Gordon Brown, in a budget in I think 2005, changed the level of duty payment on beer, because he liked beer. And so it meant that microbreweries could produce more beer before they paid duty. And that led, quite unexpectedly, and it wasn't the intended consequence, to a flourishing of microbreweries across the UK, and connected to that, a whole kind of boost to the local economy. Now, whether that's a good thing, because it's related to alcohol, is up to you to decide. But it's a really interesting example of one line in a budget that had a really big impact that no one had expected. And I think if we could think of those little policy interventions, they don't need to be huge, they could make a really big difference. So I'm going to come to you in a minute, Stu, because you have really benefited from,
There's a better one.
in some respects, from rural policy as it's changed. But just addressing the kind of global issue, Peter, and how do we, aviation fuel is a good one, because how do we unilaterally apply some of these policy measures we might like to do when the global system is not necessarily in our favour?
Yeah, I was thinking this, jotting down a couple of notes, trying to sort of think, how do I come to this specific question about current policy drivers and the landscape of which they operate in, and for some peculiar reason, it's how my brain works, so you'll have to forgive me. In the late 19th century, there was a German economist called Max Weber, and he coined the term iron cage, and to describe the current capitalist economic system, which is which can only work if it abides to unconstrained exploitation of global natural resources. That's the only way it can work. Otherwise, it would collapse. And so if you are going to actually, and we, by the way, we still work to that principle. So the current economic model, global economic model, works to Max Weber's description of it. So if you are going to, if you are tasked with trying to transition, and I mean radically transform, a food system because you know all the science tells you is it's broken, and that the impacts are far-reaching on your health and on the climate and the environment. If you want to actually push through using policy drivers a transformational change, then for as long as that system, meaning the food system, is coupled firmly to the current existing economic model, then you stand no cat's chance in hell of making that transformation. And to then put it on to the farmers to say, well, come on, you know, we've given you some incentives, but then the farmers still go back into their house faced with one simple fundamental issue and problem, which is that they then have to compete on this global market of total exploitation, and which forces them to try and drive down their production costs and cut margins, and the people who are going to help in this to achieve it are the industries, whether it is the fertilizer industries or any of those. They're all coupled rigidly to this economic system. So you'd have to really scale up and think, first and foremost, we could do this two ways. We either collapse the global economic system, and I'm all for that, and transition to a new one, or you decouple yourself from it. It's a process called degrowth, and it doesn't mean you don't grow. It means you scale down to regional. You scale down to regional and local. You close the cycle. It's called circular economics. Rawlings published a book on it called Donut Economics. It makes perfect, rational sense. So until we do that, then no amount of what looks like good 25-year environmental plan is going to work in partnership with the farmers.
So we have a couple of minutes before I want everyone to return to their props and be very brief about describing the hidden element in their prop. But just before that, I'd love to hear, Stuart, just briefly about how some of the policies, as I see it, has actually enabled the change that you've made on your farm.
So, in 2018, we were looking at our current farming system, which was still mainly arable-based with contractors, and we wanted to put some more pasture down for the cows, and we looked at the countryside stewardship options. So these are the agri-environmental schemes that are out there, to see whether basically we could get the government to pay us to do what we wanted to do. And when we looked at the numbers that came out of this, my wife, because she's far more enlightened than me, and sorry you got me, not her, that was unplanned, suddenly turned around and said, well, if this makes sense, and we don't really like the current farming system we have going on, but we need the income, why don't we just put the whole farm down? And I was like, oh, not sure about this. What's my dad going to say? But the simple fact is there is lots of money out there that is not being taken up. There are some great schemes out there. They are getting a lot more enlightened. The enforcement of countryside stewardship and the agri-environmental schemes, which have now morphed into something called the SFI, are getting a lot more flexible. We have had lots of farm visits over the last 4 or 5 years. People have very kindly been very interested in what we've been doing, and one of the most common things that we get told by farmers is, oh, well, I can't do that. It's like, well, no, not with that attitude, you can't. The paradigm shift that is required to do even a fraction of what we've done is very, very difficult. And I like the way my far more esteemed colleague than me put it, that the system that we all live in is so ingrained that to break out of it is almost impossible. The pioneers of this have normally had some life-shattering incident which has enabled them to go and do something completely outside the box. And there's lots of good books out there. And if anyone wants to talk to me about books, I have loads of books. Detailing the people who are really doing things in a different fashion have had major life shocks. That's why they're prepared to do different things. So it does come down to encouraging people to use the system that is currently in place. We have used it to our great advantage. We had a 5-year plan, which was that we wouldn't be dependent on it at the end of 5 years. Well, that 5 years ended last year, and I can safely say that the world has not obeyed. We have not been able to decouple ourselves from it, so we have signed up for a further 5 years, and we are very grateful to all the government support we get. But we do have to obey the rules, and it has fundamentally changed our farming system. So there are lots of good things out there, but people have to be so brave to change their farming systems completely. And I will finish in just 1 second. Going back to the very original question that started all of this, the one thing that I always talk about is basically a progressive tax on nitrogen fertilizer. It's one of the most pernicious parts of our production system, and it embeds huge amounts of fossil fuel energy into every food that we eat. And if the government wanted to raise some money, it could tax nitrogen fertilizer progressively, incrementally. People would know what was happening. If they had a farming system which works and needs it and can afford it, people can still use it. But mother is the necessity of all invention. And that, I think, would make a sea change in our agricultural industry. So I'll leave it at that.
And I think there are parts of the world where those nitrogen fertiliser taxes are being discussed and looked at. So it'd be interesting to see whether that's something that gets picked up here. So I'm going to ask everyone very quickly. I'm going to start, actually, because I can set the precedent and demonstrate what I'm expecting of everyone, because we're going to keep it brief. So where's my jar of beans and seeds? Is it out there? Who's got it? Fantastic. I don't need it back immediately, but does anyone want to guess how many seeds are in there? I'm going to take 2 guesses. Anyone want to guess? Yes. 4,000. Higher or lower? 3,000. Higher? Higher? Higher. 15,000. No, higher still. There's some little poppy seeds in there. There are 340,000 seeds in here, and I've been asked how I weighed them. Seeds have 1,000 weight, so you don't have to weigh very many to know how many you've got in a particular weight. So I use 1,000 weights in order to work out how many I've got in there. And those 340,000 seeds represent every potentially edible species of plant on the planet. We commonly eat, globally, 200 species. We mostly rely on just 3 species for most of our protein and carbohydrates. That's not just plant-based protein and carbohydrates, that's all of it. And those are the standard wheat, rice and maize. And it's quite extraordinary that we've become so dependent on not only a limited number of crops, but also a limited diversity within those crops. Stuart, go for it.
So, if you opened the jute bag and found my pictures, what was the common theme? What were there more pictures of than others? Okay, well, there's lots of pictures. So, the common theme about my pictures, there's 10 pictures, and there are 4 pictures of these.
All right, well done.
So, if everyone can hold up one of these pictures. So, again, my colleague could not have done it better if I'd have asked him to. The circular economy. It's here. So we know, so going back to nitrogen fertiliser. Nitrogen fertiliser, if you don't know, is mainly produced using natural gas. One of the biggest sources of natural gas, and this is, I use this all the time now, comes from Russia. So basically, if you are buying nitrogen fertiliser, you are basically paying Vladimir Putin to bomb the Ukraine. Instead, we can all use more of this. So if anyone hasn't seen the pictures, please come and look at the pictures afterwards.
Richard.
No, my prop's gone somewhere. Has anyone got it? No, it's not that one. Anyone got the picture of the school children?
Is it out there somewhere? Laminated photo? Everyone's seen it.
Everyone's seen it. I don't know where it is. Oh, there it is. It's appeared. It hasn't disappeared. Yes.
Sweet.
A picture showing children the farm, talking to them about how we farm, about the countryside. That group actually came from the inner city, and I took them to a part of the farm where they couldn't see any man-made structure at all, no buildings, no wires or anything. And for most of them, that was the first time they had ever been in such a situation. They had lived in a concrete jungle. And that was pretty frightening for me, and it actually upset some of them. One of the other scary things on some of these school visits that I've had over the years is that I find I'm having to educate the teachers as much as the children about farming and climate and food and everything. So that young generation is the generation that's going to be affected most by climate change. And it staggers me that the young generation, especially in this country, aren't more angry about it. There was
Shifting
that
baselines, Richard. Shifting baselines.
shifting baselines. But my God, if anyone's got a problem for the future, they have. And there was that Swedish girl who had a go at being angry and got on quite well for a while, but that's all sort of died a death. Yes, maybe the baseline has shifted, but the climate problem hasn't gone away. And I'm just amazed that they aren't more angry. So maybe I've done a lousy job and haven't said the right things to these kids. But I think we've got a responsibility to actually wind them up and get them going a bit.
Tell us about your mystery apples.
Okay, so I asked you to think what absences there might be here. Did anyone have any thoughts about absence? Pardon? Sprays? Yes, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, there are no sprays on that. Thank you very much for a flag. Perfection. These are some of my nicest apples. But you were right. Even so, they are not perfect. And in fact, with I don't know how it is for you, but I think we might lose up to about a third. A third of our apples aren't kind of saleable enough to put in boxes or to show, to the general public. And so this makes me think about damage and waste. I didn't put the crappy apples in. These are my nice, they're not perfect, but I think they're lovely. And so, when we think about waste, yes, in the olden days we'd also have like pigs on the farm. We might then also be processing them. So it's a bit like, it's not waste if you can do something else with it. Sometimes some of the things that you need to do, other things you need more resources. To have a juicing kit, to have your sterile kitchen to be able to sell things. And that's about infrastructure, that's about having the facilities that we might want. So, coming together in, it's very common in a lot of mainland Europe to have communal juicing facilities, to have cooperatively owned resources that you can use, because you only need them for like 4 days a year. So it's about, so one of the absences, it's, what do you do with the waste? Here we can't see the broken ones. What do we do with those waste? So that was another thing. Any other absences people thought of? You didn't see the Spartan. Spartan is naturally shiny. Some of the others, we've got our St Edmunds pippin here, is a rough-skinned one, is not shiny. So apples are different. I don't know how many of you actually touched them, but they feel different. There's a diversity in how they feel, how they look, how they smell, how they taste, their texture in your mouth. And I think that's one of the things that, unless you're lucky with your local greengrocer, it's something that you might not see. So for me, the diversity of the experience of an apple is something that's really important to hold on to. one of the things I thought somebody might say, there's something around seasonality. So this is sort of 15 out of the 30 odd varieties that we have. The discovery is long gone. You know, they crop in August. We've got the St Edmunds pippin only just made the cut because I think this is the last week that they'll be any good. There's all the ones that I couldn't bear to pick, even for your lovely people, because I was a bit like, actually they need another 2 or 3 weeks on the trees before I put them in. And this makes me think, you know, and because I only eat the apples from the farm, so I eat apples from August through to May, which is when both our Tidman's late orange and possibly our prettiest one ever, the Adams Pomain, are still going strong. And for those 3 months of the year, I don't eat apples. I eat soft fruit, I eat kohlrabi, which has a nice crunch. But actually us getting, if someone in the audience raised this, the issue of seasonality, we've become too used to what the supermarkets call perpetual global summertime. It isn't perpetual global summertime, and it rains quite a lot as well these days too, doesn't it? So we, you know, thinking about what we eat and when we eat it, so it actually tastes nice. I'm going to stop in 1 minute. The other absence that I see that you probably don't see is the amount of work that goes into producing this, you know, and it's not stupid people work, it's skilled labour to produce apples, grafting trees, planting trees, caring for trees, pruning them, properly storing them. It's the kind of thing that in an ideal world we would value with proper pay and proper rural housing. And at the moment that is a big gap, and I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
Right. Farming rules for water is something that's coming along, which may have an impact on fertiliser use. We use, just to finish off some of these things, we use human manure on the farm. I just don't have the thought that I might be putting microplastics into my fields. I hope I'm not, but there's lots of phosphate and we need it, and so we do that 1,000 to 3,000 tonnes a year. This stuff is what causes our biggest problem. It means that we can haul food around in plastic, we can do all the stupid things that we do, and it emits carbon. And education is the problem for young people. They don't know the science of climate change and the emissions that come from these things, and the wastefulness of perhaps driving around in a car that is 1.5 tonnes with only 100 kilos of a human in it. We just move the Earth's waters on wheels around. A car could, you know, be 600 kilos, but we don't. And so we use more energy than we ever need to. We stopped flying 25 years ago, so that's one thing we could do. We invested in renewable energy and all that stuff. The soil, you know, is what we need. We have to care for it. It's being degraded. Nitrogen fertiliser degrades and releases carbon. Sunlight releases carbon from soil. And it's the talk about cover crops. They're all in the SFI. It's all starting to happen. There are 25,000 live SFI agreements across the country. So farmers are slowly getting there because the old support system is being taken away. So if you want it, you're going to have to do something to get it. So it's happening. And then isn't it crazy we're a world of, in a country of food waste, obesity and food bags, as was said before. We could talk all night.
There was a horrible moment there when you started, Glenn, and I thought the bag that I'd encouraged people to open was full of human manure, but thankfully not.
Not at all. 3 years ago there was some on that field. But yeah.
Lastly, to your mysterious dish and ball.
I'll try and go through this very quickly, and you can give me a show of hands afterwards where you think you've got close to it. Okay. In 1926, there was a climatologist and physicist called Lorenz. He lived in America, but he's actually Austrian, and he produced a mathematical derived model that you can spatially depict as a basin, and we call this the basin of attraction. And all celestial bodies across the entire universe, and indeed organic ecosystems on planet Earth, can be visualized in the form of a basin. And from this basin, it has a rim, and the rim represents the boundaries of that system, whether it's planetary, ecosystems, whatever. And beyond that rim is the tipping point. And this is where the concept in 2009 was born of planetary boundaries. When you hear about planetary boundaries, there it is. It comes from Lorenz's initial model. What sits inside it is planet Earth. So there's planet Earth, like any celestial system, sitting in its basin, and it's rocking around. So whenever there's a perturbation, planet Earth will move. We've had 5 extinctions, big, huge extinctions, which have pushed planet Earth up the rim, but hasn't quite tipped it over. It had, would be Venus or Mars. So planet Earth has slipped back into its system. And so the question then is, how do we keep planet Earth in the system, in its own basin, and prevent it from tipping out? And this is the big, huge question we face about biodiversity loss globally and climate change. Well, Edward Wilson, in 2017, before he died, he was an eminent ecologist, actually calculated that you would have to give half of the world to nature if you wanted to protect just 80% of it forever. That's half the planet. So the UN took this. They took him so seriously that they took this. And Bonnie Johnson, when he went to the climate conference, and said 30% is to be protected around the planet Earth. And the UN said yes, and the other 20% has to be managed sustainably. That's where the 50%, half of Earth, came from. So on one side, that barcode represents our current global model. We're still commercializing natural capital. We need to decouple from that. And the coloring there, I'm afraid, represents the current globalization of the world's economy, which was predominantly built on a European model. And although that is changing, it still persists. There's your planet in a basin. Anybody close? Anybody close? Well,
Paul had it.
Your bowl, and I attempted to balance the ball green side up, right in the middle, and I did achieve it, but it was very difficult to do. So that, therefore, I think there's a balance. I don't know if you agree with what I'm saying, but that's right in the middle of that bowl. I managed to keep it still without it moving around. So I thought there's a balance to be had.
Yeah, well, the new understanding of system science and ecosystem science, which is my area, is that we no longer talk it's very archaic. If you forgive me for saying this, it's very archaic to talk in terms of the balance of nature and us balancing our activities with nature, because even planet Earth doesn't operate to balances. It operates to unpredictable events, and the only thing that saves planet Earth is its resilience. And if you extract its resilience from that planet, then you talk about increased vulnerabilities. So one extraction could be literally taking what Earth banked for 500 million years, which was carbon, in the form of coal, oil, and gas. It banked it, and it did it for a reason. It was keeping its resilience in check. But if you release that, then you create such vulnerabilities that you see the extreme patterns. It's a bit like you having a temperature when you have a fever. Your body's all over the place, no different from ecosystems, and that's where Lovelock came in and said, this Gaia theory, planet Earth is literally like a living body. It has a homeostatic tendency of which it has to moderate and regulate, and the only way it can do this is to ensure resilience. So, good food and care for the environment, you're on the right track.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Peter. So there we are.
I fear you balanced it because there's a slight bend in the bowl.
So it's been a fantastic discussion. We've been a big panel, you've been a big audience. It's difficult, there's so much complexity to discuss. We have got a little bit of time afterwards to have a chat, and I think there might be still a little bit of food, I'm not quite sure, maybe some apples. Fantastic. Can I just sow the seed of an idea though? Because we had a it's always important, I think, to end on some kind of positive, and I want there to be some kind of call to action, and I want us to think about what we're going to go out and do. And I think we had a reimagining the Waveney Valley event, which I'm sure some of you came to, up in our freezing cold bean store a couple of years ago. And one of the things that emerged from that, which I thought was incredibly positive, was the idea that every market town should have its own, effectively a community kitchen that's producing food, that's training people, that's teaching people how to cook, that's making food affordable, that's allowing those that can afford food to pay for that food. And that should be associated with horticultural production on the edge of the market town, which pays proper living, which pays people a proper living and trains people and ensures that and I think that's an amazing thing. What if every market town was associated with some land? What if we had a policy that allowed that to happen? And how could we make that happen for Halesworth?
Wouldn't you also like to eat bread and biscuits made with Suffolk wheat? That would be one heck of a start, that if we looked after ourselves with wheat, whether it's conventional or organic, it's a start to change, instead of it all coming from Warburton's in Manchester or some
Let's buy a mill as well.
Well, the
We've got
mills
one.
in Ipswich disappeared and we should have happened.
Fantastic. So just everyone, just a huge round of applause for the fantastic panel. Thank you for your time and your knowledge. Thank you for all of your brilliant questions, guessing with the props.
Thank you for sharing, but great sharing.
Oh, it's too difficult. There's too much to cover. Thank you.
Without any delay, food, drink, conversation.
And thank you, Rachel, as well.